Hello, welcome to .NET for the ASP.NET Core Web API from beginners to advanced. Okay, so I'm going to start with this module one foundations of the REST and the Web API and session one. On the session one, I'm going to introduce with the APIs, foundations of REST and Web APIs with clear fundamentals. Okay, so here are the agenda items. Okay, first we'll try to understand what is an API, a web API is. Okay, and a web API ecosystem. So in this ecosystem, you need to understand what is a client and the server, nothing but the consumer and the producer. Client, I consider this as the consumer and the server as the producer. Okay, so later we'll know what are the different types of APIs and API communication styles, request and the response, and with the hands-on demo. Okay, so here we'll basically this session will cover the basics of web APIs. Okay, so if you have already know with the web API from our ASP.NET Core, then that will be more helpful. The topics like basics of REST API. Okay, so JWT and everything like what the JWT tokens and all this particular topics like will help you a lot. Okay, so but in this particular course I will cover from the beginners to advanced. Okay, so here in this particular first session I'm going to cover like basically building blocks of web API. Okay, so what is a web API is what is its ecosystem. So in this ecosystem you'll have something called as producers, consumers. Okay, we have to discuss something on the API types like public, private, and partner, and communication styles on the REST, SOAP, and GraphQL. Okay, and backend work like in this particular request response, like in the basic request and the response, and validations and database handling and all the stuff. Okay, so let's get started with to the first session. Okay, so before understanding all this stuff, like first of all, we have to understand what is a web API. Okay, so a web API is nothing but a simple software. One software application is communicating to another software applications. Okay, so that software applications can be of any of these platforms. Okay, so that platforms can be one platform can be on Java. On other platform can be an .NET. Okay, so even though different software applications, okay, they can communicate to each other through a simple language called as the communication stacks, which is with the HTTP request and the response, nothing but the JSON. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand there are multiple platforms, and that particular multiple platforms can communicate with through the HTTP request and the response. Okay, the language though both the parties can understand is the contract or agreement between the both parties, nothing but your JSON request or the JSON response. Okay, so in this ecosystem, like I have this particular client and server. So client are the consumers and the server is the producer. Okay, and how they communicate, like communicate with the simple HTTP request on the response. Okay, so let me connect to my tab and explain you that in detail. Okay, okay, yeah, it's got connected. So let's understand web API and ecosystem. So what is a web API? So web API is nothing but one software application is trying to communicate to another software application, even though there are in multiple platforms. Okay, so one software application can be in Java or .NET. Another application could be any of this better thing. So multiple software applications communicating to each other through a certain level of contract or agreement between the both the parties, like whether it could be some HTTP request and the response. So they communicate with this basic contract between the both the software applications. So I call this as the web API. So one software application. So I have this one software application here, another software application here. Okay, one software application. Okay, another software application. So one software application is communicating to this particular another software. I call this thing as the web API. So one software application can be one can be in .NET, another can be in another platform. Okay, nothing but Java. So one multiple platforms are communicating to each other, even though there is multiple languages. Okay, so how is that possible? Like one of the application is in .NET and another application is in Java. So how they communicate? Because they have the common contract or agreement both between both the parties. through the exchange of XML or SOAP or the JSON. Okay, so it's nothing but they communicate through HTTP request and the response. Okay, have this HTTP request and HTTP response. So they both can understand this but communication language. Okay, so that communication can be an XML or SOAP or JSON. Okay, so they understand with the HTTP request and the response. Okay. Okay, I hope you understand this particular tool, like in multiple platform, okay, communicating to each other, and how they communicate to this common contract, like or agreement, okay, contract or agreement. So nothing but, so one of the application will say that to send this request, so to send the request format in this format and you'll get the response. Okay, so in that terminology they will have this particular common agreement or contract between the both the parties, so that particular data can be exchanged and that particular request can be taken and that particular data can be provided. Okay, so in this particular ecosystem, like you, the first thing is like the one who communicates to this another software application, I call this as the consumer. Okay, and the other is the producer. One is nothing but the consumer, another is the producer. So one who taking the services, okay, one who is requesting this thing, the one who is requesting a service, I call that as the client. Okay, so one is responding to this request, I call this as the server. Okay, so nothing but the consumers is nothing but the client and the producers are the server. Okay, we have done a simple example in our in application also, right? Like in the weather API. So we communicated to the service provider. Okay, so that web APIs and we read the data lively. So based on the city, so we read the particular data lively, right? So one thing application, I call that as the client system, which is nothing but the consumer. So one of the application is responding to that request. I call that as the server. So in this particular the one software here, it is making a HTTP request. I call this as the client. Okay. So client is nothing but the consumer, and here I call this as the producer on server, and server is nothing but the producer. Okay, I hope you understand with the client and the server. Like in the client server, like client is an application which is making a request for a service. Okay, so server is nothing but which is responding to a request. Okay, I call this as the consumers and the producers. Okay, the second thing you need to understand the communication style. The communication style, how the communication style is happening, like in that applications can communicate to each other through XML or through a SOAP or some JSON. Okay, so the particular communication styles can be anything, like in this XML, SOAP, or JSON. Like in this particular REST web APIs, so we are using JSON. Okay, REST web API that uses the JSON. Okay, the XML and the SOAP, like with the previous version, they used also. Okay, so they used XML and SOAP in the previous, like in web services, WCF services, they used a lot in XML and SOAP. Okay, these were in the web services and WCF services. So now that we are in the REST web API, so REST web APIs are to communicate through the JSON formats. Okay, so other communication styles, we have something called as OData, GraphQL. Okay, so OData, GraphQL, they communicate to each other, like in terms of this is the standard query language. Okay, standard API query language. Okay, so this way I'm going to throw some light on this better OData and GraphQL in the later sessions. Okay, so for now you understand, like in this REST API, so REST API will communicate through each other through JSON formats. Okay, the third thing is the request and the response. So whether you are client or whether you are server, nothing but whether you are consumer or producer, you need to understand the request and the response formats. Okay. So like that, whether it could be a status, like in the status codes, like in the status codes, I have something called as 200, 201, okay, 404. all this etc, all these codes will comes with the status codes. And okay, and also you need to understand the JSON formats. So all the request and the response format, like you need to understand the JSON formats. Okay, and finally you need to understand with the API types. So API types, will you have something like you may have private APIs, okay, public APIs, and you also call the partner APIs. Okay, so here are the basic ecosystem that you'll come across your complete course content. Okay, so in this particular, you need to understand what is a consumer producer, nothing but the client, who is the client and who is the server. Okay, and in the communication styles, like you have the XML formats and SOAP format, which are used in the web services and web APIs in the previous older versions. So now that we have this particular JSON formats, we are in the which uses more mainly in the web APIs. Okay, this is very important for us in with our course content. Okay, so in the request response, like in the JSON codes, you have the status codes and the JSON formats, and you need to understand the API styles, like in the private, like in the private and public and partners. Okay, private is like it is do not having any authentications. Okay, it is just you send the request and get the response. Okay, public and partners, they have the security levels, they have the JW tokens. Okay, so you need to send the JWT tokens for this particular APIs for need to communicate. Okay, so I have this private is for no authentication, and private and partners having authenticate. Okay, so understand this particular thing, like in your course content we will develop private, public and partners. Okay, so without authentication and with authentication we will be doing. Okay, so in most of the applications, like one part is applications, I wanted to have the secured way of communications. Okay, so when to use private, when to use public, and when to use partners is our way to understand the APIs. Okay, in your software applications, in your project, like you might come across like the API service layer. Okay, so you will have this UI layer. Okay, you have the business layer, you have the service layer, and you have the database access layer. Okay, so this APIs, like web APIs layer, will be communicating to this database. So you might be having a question like, even like in this thing, like I can directly communicate a database access layer to the database. Okay, so still why I need the web API? So web API will help you to have this separation of concern. Okay, so web API's purpose is like having separation of concern, separation of concern, like in database security. So mainly thing is like it acts like a plug and play through all the applications. Like in once you develop this particular APIs to which communicates to the database, like in all these APIs can be a plug and play to your mobile applications, desktop applications. Okay, so any of these particular applications, it has this UI without changing the UI layer. Okay, I have this API to be plugged to the multiple consumers. Okay, so that particular consumers can be multiple consumers. So the consumers can be mobile or desktop. Okay, it is, and I hope you understand like why we need the web APIs. Okay, even though you have this direct communication to the database, and I can directly communicate to the database using the entity framework or ADO.NET or LinkU, still why do I have this web API? So it serves as the separation of concern. Okay, database security and multiple consumers, like in the multiple consumers, like it could be a mobile application and desktop. So I can just put this APIs as a plug and play, and to make use the APIs to be accessible to the multiple consumers. Okay, so I hope you understand the complete what is a web API and ecosystem. Okay, so let's do a demo with a simple demo, like in having a simple get API. Okay, so here we are in web API and session 1 on the REST API introduction. So let me open this. Okay, so I created a simple web API. So here is my controller over here, movies controller. I have this model movies, like in having the in ID, title, and hero. Okay. So here I have this movies, like in this title and the hero. Okay. what is the title and what is the who is the hero of this movie. I have this list of items. Okay, so this list of items, like I am going to have have the movies. Okay, so I'm returning this list of movies in this get API. Okay, so let me write another endpoint over here. Okay, so let's do that. Integer movies of find. I'm just filtering with the movie list. Okay, so not found. Okay, movies. So save everything. Okay, just run this. So I hosted this thing in this launch settings. Okay, I hosted everything in this 7079 7074. Okay, if we can, it's taking some time to run this. Okay, so simple controller. I just wanted to demo with a simple controller, like in having a list of objects to be list of models to be read that data, and I'm just filtering with the ID. Okay, just paste it. So I just wanted to navigate to the endpoint API slash movies. Okay, it is giving me the list of movies. Okay, so if I wanted to filter, so with the slash one. Okay, so I'm just getting this Bahubali Prabhas. Okay, so similarly for the Interstellar, like Christopher. Okay, so let me take that. So I hope you understand like what we have done in this particular demo. So simple APIs, like in simple API, I have this particular list of movies and just I'm displaying the movies and I'm just filtering the movies. Okay. So in this thing, you need to understand what is the producer and consumer. So here one we have produced a simple REST API. Okay, so I call this myself as the producer, and from here this client applications like from the Microsoft Edge, and I'm just requesting based on this particular request and the response, I'm getting the response. See here, if I go through this thing. Okay, if I open the Edge, so this communication through is possible through the simple lang HTTP request and the response. Okay, so this party here, this party like in the developmenting this particular ASP.NET Core Web API, I call this as the producer. Here I'm just requesting this thing, so I'm taking this particular services. So I call this as the consumer. Okay, so here in both the applications can understand this contract based on certain contract. It is able to understand or agreements through HTTP request and the response. Okay, so I made a HTTP GET request and I got the JSON response over here. Okay, so I hope you understand what is consumers and producers. Okay, and the communication style, like in the communication style, they are using like simple HTTP request and the response and the JSON format. Okay, and the status codes, like we'll come more details in the coming session on the status codes. Okay, so on the API styles, like in this is the simple demo without authentication, right? So I call this as the private, like in public. Sorry, this is the public. So no, without authentication, I call this as the public. And when there is authentication, I call them as a private or partners. Okay, in most of the applications, like in most of the applications, you will come across this in your project with the web APIs. Nothing but we use web APIs to for separation of concern, database security, multiple consumers. Okay, so multiple consumers to act like a plug and play. Okay, so for mobile and or desktop, whichever the applications that are there, so you can use the same APIs for the multiple applications. So that's the purpose of the having these web APIs. Okay, I hope you understand the basics of web API and what is web API and what is ecosystem. Okay, so let's catch up with the next session. Okay, next session we'll try to understand REST architecture and REST constraints. Okay, so let's catch up in the next session. Okay, thank you. Thanks for watching.